Good morning and welcome to this webinar dedicated to the future new aid scheme for companies investing in charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, and also the advantage that you, companies, will be able to draw from them. A quick reminder, in its National Energy and Climate Plan, Luxembourg foresees that by 2030, 49% of passenger cars registered in the country should be electric or plug-in hybrid. In July 2020, a first incentive scheme for charging infrastructure for private persons was established with two specific schemes, the Clever Fueren incentive for the purchase of electric vehicles and the Clever Lueden incentive for the installation of private charging stations. In order to complete this system, the government is preparing now to introduce a new aid scheme for companies investing in charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. Two types of aid are planned. One aid for companies, which will be granted following a competitive procedure, calls for project, and one aid reserved for SMEs, with the aim of encouraging them to make their own transition to electromobility as part of their economic activity. On the initiative on the Ministry of the Economy and the Ministry of Energy and Spatial Planning, with the support of Luxinnovation and Klima-Agence, this information webinar will present you in detail these new measures and the advantages that you will be able to draw from them. At the end of the presentation, there will be a question answer session, but of course, don't hesitate to use the questions frame on the bottom right of the screen to ask questions during the presentation. We will, of course, do our best to answer as many questions as possible, but be aware that there will be also a FAQ document published on the Klima-Agence and the Luxinnovation website. Now I give the floor to the first speaker of this webinar from the Ministry of the Economy. Please welcome Mr. Bob Fight.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel, and good morning to everyone. I'll give you a quick introduction to the upcoming aid scheme, and I'm sure the presentation will pop up any second. Before entering into the detail of the scheme, I think it's important to put the new aid instrument into context. As you're probably aware, the transport sector represents almost 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions, which is why this aid scheme is an important pillar to reduce Luxembourg's emissions. As you can see on this slide, which basically reflects Luxembourg's National Energy and Climate Plan, the trajectory is quite clear on how to reduce the emissions until 2030 by 55% compared to the baseline 2005. As you probably are aware of, the different initiatives put in place and the increasing demand for electric cars, including not only 100% electric, but also plug-in hybrids for 2021. There have been around 9,000 new registrations. Overall, the market share is still fairly small, but we can see there's a significant increase over the years, and demand will increase even further in the upcoming years. Currently, the market share is around 3.9%. The aid scheme we'll present today is part of a broader initiative by the government. There have already been measures put in place to support private households to foster charging at home for electric vehicles, but have also been deployment of some basic public charging infrastructure, the so-called Chargy and Superchargy network. To complete the puzzle, the government decided to put in place the scheme we will present today, not only to foster charging at work, but also to sort of broaden and enlarge the publicly available charging infrastructure. To this end, I'll go into more detail of the aid scheme we have proposed and which still has to go through the legislative proposal. There are basically two pillars. The first being on sort of bigger charging infrastructure projects, which have to go through a competitive bidding process. which will be announced by the ministries a couple of weeks ahead, so companies can prepare itself. And I'll go into more detail in the coming slides. The second pillar would be charging infrastructure, or aid for charging infrastructure, dedicated or reserved only to small and medium-sized companies. So it's on a first come, first served basis, where we sort of aim at smaller charging infrastructure projects. Of course, both pillars aim to promote electric vehicles altogether, and to incentivize companies to go towards more e-mobility. As you can see at the bottom of the slide, there's some specification as regards to charging infrastructure. So the draft law we've presented to Parliament also tackles the issue of the publicly available charging infrastructure, and will reorganize or restructure how the system works according to the European legislative framework. Getting into the gist of the presentation, and basically the eligibility criteria, who is actually eligible. As you know, there's already an aid scheme in place for private households, so this only focuses on companies. So any legal entity that carries out an economic activity is eligible under this scheme. In addition, it's important to clarify that you could be eligible through a financial lessor, meaning that if the aid has to be passed through the financial lessor to the final beneficiary, those two types of companies are eligible. As regards to costs, as you can imagine, of course, the charging station itself is eligible, but in addition, the grid connection and grid reinforcements, which are an important pillar to set up charging infrastructures, are also eligible. Intelligent load management systems, so sort of the smart charging software, is also eligible, and devices enabling transmission of data, as well as the payment system, site signalage, and any sort of civil engineering works are eligible. What is excluded? As you can probably imagine, any second-hand components or accessory components, such as a roof or photovoltaic panels, are excluded for this specific aid. Operating costs are not covered. In addition, any costs the company may have due to or which are already foreseen through regulatory or legislative obligations. In addition, preliminary studies are not eligible for this specific scheme. An important point to stress is that the costs are always excluding VAT and other levies. Moving on to an important principle as regards state aid, which doesn't only apply to this scheme, but to any state aid measure. Basically, the aid the government awards must incentivize the company to carry out the project. Basically, if the company would have carried or realized the project without any aid from the government, then there was no necessity of awarding the aid, thus the company would not be eligible. How to verify this? There are different manners. I think the most formal or simplistic approach to verify whether the incentive effect is given is whether the company has already started the project before submitting an aid application. If that's the case, the project is not eligible. So it's important to stress that before starting the project, and the start of the project does not mean that you actually have to dig or install the charging infrastructure, but it's already any sort of legally binding commitment you take, or invoice you get for a specific order. So that's very important to stress. Companies that have already started or made an order for any equipment are not eligible. any project that hasn't started and requires a public intervention to realize the project, those are the project we aim at. So that's an important point to keep in mind when submitting an aid application. Of course, if the company wants to do some feasibility studies or needs to get some permits, that doesn't put into question the incentive effect. However, these costs, for example, the costs related to feasibility studies, as mentioned earlier, are not eligible. Another important aspect is that companies which are in difficulty are not eligible. That's again an EU principle or basic rule stating that companies, for example, for SMEs, if you have losses carried forward which are larger than half of the subscribed capital, in that case, the company must be qualified as an undertaking in difficulty and cannot benefit from aid. In addition, if the company has already received an illegal aid and has to reimburse it, it cannot receive any aid until the reimbursement has been done. And of course, one cannot accumulate multiple aids for the same costs. Otherwise, we would overcompensate the project. Moving on to more specific eligibility criteria as regards the charging infrastructure. These charging infrastructure has to be 100% powered by renewable electricity and have to be put in place within 12 months of granting the aid. In addition, once the charging infrastructure is in service, it has to run or be operated over 5 or at least 5 years. Another aspect that is important to highlight is the fact that charging infrastructure which are intended for resale or rent are not eligible except for financial leases, where under certain condition where the final beneficiary has to acquire the charging infrastructure at the end of the contract are eligible. Then it's also important to stress that the offers provided on the charging infrastructure must be reasonable or must offer reasonable prices and must be comparable and transparent to final or to end users. Last but not least, if a company submits an aid application based on the land of which the company is not the owner, the company has to submit sort of an agreement in principle it has reached with the owner of the land concerning the use for installing the charging infrastructure. So that's an important point that we always check whether the company is the ultimate owner of the land or not. Furthermore, as regards publicly accessible infrastructure, there are additional criteria or conditions that apply. The first one being that has to be an ad hoc payment foreseen. My apologies. There has to be an ad hoc payment to be foreseen. In addition, the access has to be non-discriminatory with regard to conditions and prices towards mobility service providers. So that's a very important point. And the charging infrastructure has to foresee communications of static and dynamic data. The point being that end users should be able to see on the website whether the charging infrastructure is actually accessible or not. In addition, it's important that the charging infrastructure is accessible 24/7 if it's a 24/7 charging infrastructure. That meaning that the unavailability rate has to be lower than 5% per charging point, or if the charging infrastructure has 4 or more charging points, the overall unavailability has to be lower than 1.5%. That is to make sure that the charging infrastructure is accessible as much as possible. In addition, another important point, a charging infrastructure that wants to be qualified as a publicly available or publicly accessible has to be accessible without prior notice. This means that an end user can actually drive up to the venue and make use of the charging infrastructure without having to book in advance or to inform the operator beforehand. Some limitations may apply, of course. Let's imagine there's charging infrastructure on the parking. Of course, the parking operator can ask for a fee for entering or for parking the car or vehicle on that venue. Last but not least, if it's public land, the charging infrastructure has to demonstrate that it's renewable electricity purchase agreements and that it's integrated into the Chargy OK system. That would be as regards the general criteria, and I'll pass on the floor to Jean-Michel again to elaborate on the next slide.
Thank you very much, Bob. I remind you that you can ask your questions in the frame at the bottom right of your screen. Don't hesitate to do it. We'll be there to answer those questions. Please now welcome our second speaker from the Klima-Agence. I'll leave the floor to Mr. Jan Trausch.
Yes, hello, thank you. So I'd like to firstly apologize, Monsieur Hackspiel, who could not be present today. I was asked to take over their part, and I try my best to give you an overview about how much the grant could be for you. So as said, the scheme is split in two. So two axes. The first axis is the call for projects. The idea is to give a competitive bidding process to the different companies, actors who would like to build, install a larger charging infrastructure. Therefore, the minimum charging capacity per project is set to 175 kilowatt. The tender, the call for projects is is split in three. So there is a distinction between the public accessibility, the completely public accessible charging infrastructures will have a maximum 8 intensity of 50%. For the scoring in the selection, there will be the weighing factor of 1 or 100%. Semi-accessible charging infrastructures will have a maximum 8 intensity of 40% with a weighing factor of 80. And then there is also the possibility for private charging infrastructures that will have a maximum 8 intensity of 30% and a weighing factor of 60%. So to give just a few examples, what could these different accessibility degrees be, or you can look. So public accessibility would be park and rides, parking spots on the side of public roads, airports, etc. So where there's in principle an access 24 hours, 7 days. Semi-accessible charging infrastructures, that would be something like gated supermarket parkings, or employee parkings that are only accessible for the public during certain hours. And of course, the private charging infrastructures where it's a closed off spot where only employees can charge or park, or where there's a delivery fee to be charged. So then another note, the maximum 8 intensity can be up or increased to 70% if the specific call is limited to certain categories, specifically like the charging of trucks, or if it's a spot in a certain geographical region. So as I mentioned before, it's a call of projects, so there will also be a selection process. Here's a small example how this could look. For this call for project, the budget is set to 400,000 euros. The maximum budget for such a call can be 7 million euros. So there can be a different budget allocated to the different call for projects. So here it's for 5 projects that were submitted. The first one would be a private project with a capacity of 1,500 kilowatt with a requested aid of 90,000 euro. And this would equal to a subsidy of 60 euro per kilowatt. For the selection process, we still have to add the weighing factor, which would mean for the selection, this project would have a score of 100 euro per kilowatt. For the project 3, which would be a public accessible project with a capacity of 2,000 kilowatt, sorry, the subsidy would be 100,000 euros, and in the end it would be equal to 50 euro per kilowatt. Oh, sorry, there was a little bug. For the selection process, we would again add the weighing factor, which would be in this case 1, so we would have a score of 50. And then lastly, we take the project 5. This is then a semi-accessible project with a capacity of 1,000 kilowatt and a requested subsidy of 120,000 euro, which would then equal again to 120 euro per kilowatt. And then again, for the selection with the weighing factor, we would have a score of 150 euro per kilowatt. So as it's usual for such tenders, the most cost-efficient project will be selected at the end. So we would in fact have the project 3, 1, and 5 that would be selected until the allocated budget is filled up. So in this case, this would then be equal to the 310,000 euro. So the other 2 projects can no longer fall into this call. Here it's also noted that yes, to incentivize the competitive behavior or the competitive aspects of this call, a maximum of 90% of submitted projects are selected. So even if the budget would be enough for all the projects, 10% will not be selected. I think this is all for this point. So some points to consider when someone is preparing a submission. So as mentioned, the charging capacity will be considered for the call for projects. This means there will be a slight difference between AC charging and DC charging. For AC charging, the sum of the nominal capacities of charging points will be considered. So this is regardless of the grid connection capacity. The logic behind is that AC charging in most cases will be long-time charging, so on park and rides or other parking spots where the different charging points can be charged throughout the day. So it's more important that it's not as much important to have the full capacity added simultaneously, but more throughout the day, especially if one is using smart charging. On the other hand, DC, here it's important to have the maximum capacity at a simultaneous time. So the capacity considered is the sum of the maximum capacity that can be made available for minimum duration of 1 hour. And this is at a voltage of 400, which should be should be considered the usual voltage used by the actual electric vehicle at the moment. So then a company can submit several projects for a given call, or they can group all their projects infrastructures under one single project. If this is the case, and especially if there are different charging infrastructures with different accessibilities, for the purpose of the selection, the lowest degree of accessibility will be considered in the selection process. Also, public accessible charging stations have different specific requirements, but they also allow the highest 8. So it is important to look at the projects and allocate them wisely. So maybe it can be more advantageous to package all the public accessible infrastructures into one single package, and all the semi and private infrastructures into another, but still under the same company. So next I will give a few illustrative examples. Here we have a car park that is equipped with semi-public charging stations. There will be 50 charging points with 22 kilowatt. For the selection process, there will be the capacity considered will be 1.1 megawatt, and it will in total have an estimated cost, including a network connection, around 207,000 euro, and the subsidy can take up to 82,000 euro. So the next one is a bit more of an extreme example. On the other end of the scale, there are then 16 hyperchargers with a capacity or charging power of 300 kilowatt. For the selection process, the total capacity of 3.2 megawatt will be considered. This totals then in estimated costs of a bit over 2 million euro, and the subsidy would then be 1 million euro, which would be then the cap for one project, for one company. So next I will talk a bit more about X2, which is then the age for charging infrastructures specific for small and medium-sized enterprises. This is a bit more of the traditional grant scheme where the enterprise can request aid via a simple form, I say. The only distinction here is between small and medium enterprises, where for small enterprises, then the maximum aid intensity can take up to 40%, medium enterprises only 30%. If there are more than 4 charging stations, a bonus of 10% is possible to include smart charging solutions. And specificity here is that there will also be a maximum aid intensity for network connection costs, which in our experience is in such projects is often the more important cost. So the absolute ceiling is then 40,000 euro for all the costs relating to the charging infrastructure. So the stations, the smart charging solutions, this is all falls all under the 40,000 euro, and then we have 60,000 euro for everything that is network connection costs. So that's in case that the available network capacity is not enough, and you have to install a transformator or other reinforcements. Those costs all fall under this 60,000 ceiling. Some other points to consider: the absolute ceiling, so the 40,000 plus 60,000 euro applies to one company, one group. And also one group or each group can only submit one aid request per year, but the total ceiling applies throughout the lifetime of this regime. So the different charging infrastructure projects again can be grouped under one demand, but they can only be done once a year. And also the application has to be submitted before the work begins. So again, a few examples. Here it's for a small private charging infrastructure with 4 charging points there will be no smart charging solution. The estimated costs for the installation are 9,500 euro. And added to this, some network reinforcement costs of 5,000 euros. So, and then the subsidy will be then 5,850 euros. Here is another example, a bit larger charging infrastructure for a company with indoor parking. Here is a smart charging solution included, so that depending on the external factors, there is also always enough charging power there for all the different cars. The estimated costs for the installation are 38,000 euro. And then for the network reinforcement costs, 25,000 euros, which would then equal a maximum subsidy of 34,000 euros. And then another example, so for this, the Axis 2, there is no distinction between AC and DC charging. So there's also a possibility to install fast charging stations under the right circumstances and ask for an aid under this pillar. So here it's then 2 fast charging stations, a cost of 150,000 euro. Network reinforcements costs 120,000 euro. And then the subsidy would hit the ceiling with the 100,000 euro. So I think this will then be some closing remarks. So as you may notice, the law is not yet voted yet, and the measure will then therefore likely enter into force this summer. Everything we showed you here is still subject to the finalization of the legislative and regulatory procedures. So it could always be possible that there are some slight changes in the end. But for the companies that are already interested in preparing a project for this both axes here, they can already take some first steps, like definition of the number of charging points and their total capacity. They can already check if what the capacity, their actual capacity at the moment is, and if need be, look for ways to reinforce this the capacity. They can think about how public accessible the charging infrastructure should be. They can think about the possibilities of smart charging, and they can try to get a feeling for the cost and aid intensity that is required for their project. But as already said before, they aren't allowed to try to start the construction work or any other investments for these projects to be eligible for the aid. So no work can be begin, and yes, so that the incentive aspect of the project can be confirmed. So, and this is the last slide of this presentation of this part. All the different informations and forms will also be available throughout the MyGuichet platform. There will also be some support by the Klima-Agence and Luxinnovation for companies that have more questions regarding the measures, and also like to be accompanied in their efforts. And there will also be a publication of an FAQ on the guichet.lu and also on our respective websites. So if there are any questions, you can write them in the tab questions. I try to answer as much as I can, but in the case that there are some questions left unanswered, there will be also always the FAQ that will integrate all the different questions. And then for my part, I will now present a few of our services that we offer as Klima-Agence. Firstly, I'd like to say a few words about the Klima-Agence. Maybe some of you still know us under the name of My Energy. We are the national structure for that accompanies all the actors of our society in the efforts of the climate protection and energy transition. Our main target groups are individual persons, municipalities, and other institutional actors, experts of the sector, and of course companies. And our support can take on different forms, and I will try to present a few of them now. So within the framework of the aid scheme, we offer the following services, or we take on the following roles. Firstly, we are a facilitator for the purpose of the technical realization of the project. So this means we offer standardized documents with some technical input and other informations on the procedures in place. And we also offer matchmaking via the www.procharging.lu that I will present a bit later. Then we are also taking charge of project carriers other than companies. So we can still be a first contact for any interested party that needs some further information. But here it's mainly the promotion of matchmaking between municipalities and project developers, and you have also always other interaction with other groups, mainly to inform them of their role in this framework and the possibilities to aid project developers and municipalities in their efforts. And of course, there will always be a general sensibilization concerning e-mobility for all the different actors. So I will present now a few printed documents that we offered in the past. First, there's our brochure, Comment charger votre voiture électrique, so how to charge your electric vehicle. This was one of our first documents that we published, and it's targeted for general public, and it's just to explain and detail a bit more the everything about the charging of electric vehicles. Then we have a more technical document, the planning guide for residential and functional buildings. This is a document that's mostly targeted to architects, engineers, and planners, and was developed jointly with the Ministry of Energy, the DSOs, and external consultants to regroup all the different technical and legal aspects and requirements of a charging infrastructure under one roof into one document. And there are also periodic adaptations to always be up to date with all the legal and technical requirements. And then a little spin-off from this document, we developed an information sheet for tradesmen to assist them in the installation and foremost in the inspection of the charging stations in the residential sector. So a target group is, so there's a detailed version of this information sheet for tradesmen that in the end will install the charging infrastructure. And there's also a simplified version for the individuals, SMEs, and artisans that just want to be informed what steps to take during the installation of a charging station. So then some of our online tools. This is one of our tools is a charging station comparison tool. This is focused mainly on the residential sector, but there's also the idea to further develop it in the framework of this grant scheme to also include smart charging solutions and mainly DC charging stations. So here the user has the possibility look for charging station via a survey that defines a bit more their specific needs, and then gives a list of all the charging stations that could fulfill those requirements. But also, if the user already has a specific model in mind, they can also look up with the model with our drop-down menu. In case that the charging station is not on the list, there can always be made a request for additions via e-mobility at Klima-Agence.lu. So this tool is also regularly updated according to the requests that we received and were evaluated by our external consultant. Then a new tool that will be launched probably in the coming days and weeks. It's the site procharging.lu. This is a matchmaking site for all the different actors that exist already on a similar form in Germany, and has had some success there. So we decided to transpose it to the Luxembourgish needs. This means this will be an interactive tool that's freely accessible, mainly to allow the matchmaking between municipalities and investors. With the help of an interactive map, yes, users can indicate surfaces that are available for the installation of a public charging infrastructure. And after interested parties, they can directly contact the owners via this tool. There's also a possibility to get information of existing mobility concepts in the different municipalities if they are uploaded. And also there will be the FAQ that I already mentioned, and additional information through the grant scheme will also be published on that site. So it's basically to have all the different information in one place. And then if you speak about municipalities, you also have to mention Climate Pact 2.0, where also the municipalities have possibilities to promote their efforts in the field of sustainable mobility, either in terms of strategy, mobility, and circulation planning, in terms of concrete projects where they plan the electrification of their vehicles, or they need to adapt their parking space management, or also in terms of collaboration with their citizens, where they communicate with citizens and enterprises on the general topic of electromobility, but they also have the possibility to grant a financial support via a grant scheme. So there are some means for the municipalities to get mobilized in the framework of this grant scheme. And I think, yes, that was then the last slide for me, and then I will pass on the word to the next.
Thank you very much, Jan, for this presentation, for these presentations. And please note that you will, of course, receive a link after this webinar to watch the replay. And the presentation slides will also be available very soon on the Luxinnovation and Klima-Agence websites. And now, please welcome our last speaker from Luxinnovation, Mr. Maximilian Pschibil.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel, for the introduction, and good morning to all of you also from my side. So now that you have seen the presentation of Klima-Agence and know a little bit more about how they can support you in the preparation of all the more technical aspects of the aid application, I would now also like to show you how we at Luxinnovation can also assist you within this application process. So one of the main elements of our support consists in helping you verify your general eligibility to these state aids. And in particular, with regards to the different eligibility criteria which have already been mentioned during the previous presentations. In general, the eligibility to state aid funding needs to be assessed from two angles. So first of all, is the project eligible, which is actually what we have been discussing so far? And second, is the applicant company eligible? And it is especially with regards to the second question where our team can support you to verify your general eligibility to this aid scheme and to support you by demonstrating this eligibility within your aid application. Therefore, we will try to understand your company's current situation, its shareholding structure, and also the group that it might be part of. Because as you have heard previously, one main eligibility criteria of this new aid scheme is the size of the group, so being an SME or a large company. And this criterion does not only need to be assessed at the level of the legal entity applying for this aid, but also at the level of the single economic entity, which is a rather broad notion of group. But I will get back to this in just a minute. So on this slide, you can see the general timeline or the process of applying for state aid, with step 4 in the middle of the slide being the final submission to the ministries via the myguichet.lu platform. As mentioned, the support and coaching from Luxinnovation will take place during the preparation of your aid application and thus before the final submission. As I mentioned before, the first and most important step of our support is to help you verify all the different eligibility criteria. But in addition, we will also inform you on the required templates, and we will help you ensure that your aid application is complete before you submit it to the ministries. There we work also closely together with the colleagues from Klima-Agence, who will be able to support you on all the more technical aspects of the aid application. So to summarize this slide, our main goal would be to help you prepare your aid application in the best possible way so that it contains all the required documents and that it already addresses all the questions that could become relevant during the ministry's instruction and decision process that will take place after your submission via myguichet.lu. I would now also like to briefly summarize the main eligibility criteria, which we have already talked about before and on which we can really support you during the preparation of your application. First of all, there's the question on the size of the company, which will be a determining factor within this new aid scheme to know whether or not your company can access the bottom-up aids reserved for SMEs, or if your company is part of a larger group and would therefore need to apply within Axis 1, the call for projects. In addition, we can also support you on verifying the undertaking in difficulty criterion by analyzing your accounting information to verify that your company, so neither the applicant company nor the group itself, would need to be considered as being in difficulty based on the European rules. In addition, we would also verify together with you that the aid that you request from the ministry does only cover costs which have not already been covered by other state aids, because the accumulation of aids for the same costs cannot be subsidized by the ministry. And last but not least, I would also like to stress again the importance of the incentive effect, which has already been explained by Mr. Veit previously, and which indicates that it is really necessary to submit your aid application to the ministry before starting any work on the project, and also before committing or before placing any binding orders. So you should really avoid, for instance, paying an upfront payment or accepting a quote from a subcontractor before submitting the aid application. Otherwise, your project can unfortunately not be considered as eligible for this new aid. And last but not least, you can see on this slide also a short summary of the way in which we could work together during the preparation of your aid application. So on the company side, you would need to first define the scope and the costs of the project that you would like to implement. And in addition, you should also already apply for all the required authorizations and fill in the required templates of the ministries. These templates will be available once the new law has been voted. And on the side of Luxinnovation and Klima-Agence, we will be there to support you on the one hand to verify the eligibility criteria, but in addition, we will also be there to help you ensure the completeness of your application and to proofread your application before the final submission. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm already looking forward to your questions.
Many thanks, Maximilian, for your presentation. That is now the end of the first part of this webinar. Now it's time for the question answer session, and we have some questions that we will now treat. And the first one is for you, Bob Fight. The obligation to have the charging infrastructure running within 1 year after the aid award seems quite challenging. What if the companies have a delay due to the grid operator?
Thank you, Jean-Michel, and thank you for the question as well. I think we mentioned it earlier that we do know that there's a high demand to put in place charging infrastructure for companies as quickly as possible, which is why there's also a delay of 1 year. However, we are fully aware that there may be some delays due to sort of the end supplier of the charging infrastructure or due to the grid operator, which may delay or force the company to exceed the 1 year obligation. In that regard, if the company exceeds this delay, and the delay is not due to sort of a voluntary act by the company itself, but is out of his own means. In that case, we would just require sort of a document by the company explaining where the delay comes from. And in that case, the company will not be penalized for that. That being said, we do of course hope that the companies will be able to meet the 1 year deadline. But again, depending on the cause of the delay, we do accept if companies exceed that specific obligation.
Mm-hmm. And it's in this global context. Which recommendation would you give to companies when participating in the call for projects?
When participating in call for projects, so that's the first axis, the first pillar of the scheme we just presented. The overall recommendation would be to start already now assessing which e-mobility concept the company or which e-mobility concept is best for the company, and preparing the file for submission, reaching out to Klima-Agence, to Luxinnovation as quickly as possible to prepare your file. As regards the call for projects specifically, Jan already pointed it out, that if within one project there are different degrees of accessibility, we take the lower one for the entire project. As a result, companies are by default incentivized to bundle or all the charging infrastructure of the same degree of accessibility within one project and submit 1 or 2 to that end. I think another important point to stress once again, given that it's a competitive bidding process, it would be wise not to, unless the project really needs it, to ask for the maximum state aid intensity, which is foreseen by the law, given that there will be a ranking will be put in place based on the aid amount the company requests for the charging capacity it will install. So it's really recommended that the company limits its aid demand to the strict minimum necessary to realize the project.
Thank you, Bob. We have another questions, a lot of another questions for you. Do you have any idea about upcoming timeline when the first call for projects will be made?
As regards the timeline, it has already been presented as regards the legislative process, which is still ongoing, and we do have to wait for the Parliament to adopt the law. That being said, we do hope that we will be able to launch a first call before the summer, basically.
Okay, we will wait for this. Can a company submit an aid application under the both axes you described, and can also a company submit several aid applications at the same time?
So yes, a company can submit, if you are an SME, an aid application under Axis 1, so the call for projects for bigger projects, and Axis 2, which is reserved for SMEs. However, the company cannot submit for the same cost, for the same charging infrastructure, a project both under the Axis 1 and Axis 2. As regards Axis 1, the company can submit several projects within one call, for example. However, as regards Axis 2, the company, and in particular the group to which it belongs, can only submit one application per year. So that's quite important to know. And so in that regard, the company are invited to sort of plan their projects in this respect.
Okay. Another question about the criteria of eligibility. What is the difference between a company and a group?
The difference between a company and a group is basically when we refer to the company itself, one could say it's the legal entity applying for the aid, and the group would be the mother company which owns the legal entity applying for the aid. So we do have to verify, as Luxinnovation has already explained, certain criteria on both levels. And it's important to stress that if you have a shareholder or another legal entity owning your company, in that respect, you have to be aware that you are part of a group, and different rules have to be fulfilled, and different documents has to be delivered. And in that process, Luxinnovation can help you with.
Okay. And another question is, what is the delay between applying demand and approval of this demand?
The delay really depends on how much aid application will be submitted, as well as for Axis 1 as for Axis 2. We will, however, as the ministry, try to do our utmost to handle the files within a couple of weeks, to make sure that companies will get a feedback as quickly as possible and have legal certainty as to whether they receive state funding or not. And here, maybe to point out again, it's the better the files or the aid applications are prepared, the faster we can handle the cases. So we really invite you again to reach out to Luxinnovation and Klima-Agence to verify or to prepare specifically the attached documents we require for proof. May that be the company size, the notion of undertaking difficulty, or the more technical aspects.
Maybe Maximilian or Jan, can you complete the answer from Bob about this point?
Yes, so I can also just underline that the sooner we can collaborate together with the companies to prepare their aid application, the better, of course. And as always, because I also read the question in the chat, the services of Luxinnovation and Klima-Agence are free of charge. We are really public agencies there to support you to prepare your aid applications. We try to be complementary to the market, but we do not try to substitute any market players. That's maybe also important to mention in this case.
Yes, thank you. Jan, maybe?
Yes, well, no additions there. It's the same for us. We offer the services free of charge, but again, we are limited in the scope of the council we can offer. We are always there for any interested parties to make them familiarize themselves with the subjects in the beginning of their reflections on the projects, on the scope they want to take. And we are also supporting them with the different documentations, but it's no replacement for a concrete counsel from a professional actor from the sector. So there's a bit of limitation, but we try to offer as much service so that, as mentioned, that the projects are rounded off in a wild manner, so that there are no problems later in the application process.
Okay, thank you, Jan. We have a few other questions from the audience. The first one is, how long is the Subside system planned to last? Maybe
I think that has also been a point mentioned by Jan. So basically, it will run for 3 years. So it's limited in time, where the idea is basically to kickstart the whole or incentivize the companies to go towards e-mobility in the first place. Yeah.
Okay. I don't think that there is other questions now from the audience. So, except if one of the speaker want to add something, we will
I may have another. I saw another question as regards the
sorry.
services provided by Luxinnovation and Klima-Agence, whether they are sort of compulsory to one extent, and whether they have to be paid. But I think that has been addressed.
Yes, Maximilian just, and of course Jan just talked about it. Okay, so I think this is now the end of this webinar. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your interactive participation, and of course, thank you to all our speakers, Bob Veit, Jan Trausch, and Maximilian Pschibil. I wish you all a wonderful day, and see you soon. Bye.